Okay, good morning, everyone. Happy Father's Day. Happy Juneteenth. Happy solstice. Happy Sunday. Happy life. And life, a happy life of any kind, includes the experience of grief as well. That's what we're going to talk about today. The topic is grief. And there's a number of reasons why I've chosen this particular topic. Number one, unless you've been visiting another planet the last few months, you're very much aware that we are engaged in what someone called a pile of crises. We're becoming very aware of the deep pain of racism and its impact on our African American community, the pain that they've been carrying as well as others for many decades. That's coming up to be honored and to be acknowledged and to be healed. And also, as you are well aware of, we're in the midst of one of the worst pandemics this planet has seen in recent times. We've lost, 125,000 was the last number I heard. That's more losses of American lives, anyway, than we lost in the Vietnam War, in the Korean War, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, and all of the other, quote, skirmishes that we've been involved in since World War II. All of this in a period of less than 6 months. So it's horrific. Another reason I want to talk about grief is that grief is an inevitable part of human life. And that's depicted by the well-known story of the time a woman came to the Buddha with her dead child in her arms, grieving horribly, as anyone would who lost a child. This is a parable or a fable. She said to him, "Oh, Master, I know that you have the power to bring my daughter back to life. Will you do so?" And he smiled and he looked at her with compassion and he said, "I will if you will first go into the village and gather one feather from every family that has not known grief, that has not known death." And as you probably know, she came back empty-handed and featherless. And she realized that she had been healed in a very deep way by recognizing and accepting her daughter's death and accepting grief as a way of life, as a part of life. That's a very deep healing. So grief is part of being human. Even certain animals apparently experience grief as well. And a third reason, or fourth reason, I've lost count, for choosing this topic, and this is the one I want to talk about primarily, is that grief is an inevitable part of the spiritual journey. And the reason for that is that although we talk often about spiritual growth, and particularly in the West, we have this model of onward and upward and bigger and better, that so-called spiritual growth is really, as most of us are learning, is more a process of letting go than of gaining. Spiritual growth is not so much learning as it is unlearning, not so much gaining as it is releasing. In the beautiful book of Chinese wisdom, the Tao Te Ching, there's a quote that says, in the pursuit of learning, every day something is gained. In the pursuit of the Tao, every day something is released. So it's about letting go. And any time we let go of something that we are emotionally attached to, grief is inevitable. It's painful. It's difficult. And paradoxically, what we're letting go of is not real, because if it's real, it can't be let go of. It's always here. What we're letting go of really doesn't exist, and yet it sure feels like it. It may be an illusion, but it can be a very painful illusion. So that's the paradox. We cannot dismiss it or dance around it by saying, well, it's all an illusion, it's not real. Even though that may be true in one sense, in our human experience, it's certainly not true. It feels very, very real. So, spiritual growth is really a process of letting go. The journey, then, of spiritual unfoldment, that's what I call it, unfoldment, is one of making friends with letting go, making friends with grief. So I'd like to talk about what that means, you see. To make friends with grief means to allow it, to accept it, and to learn from it. To learn from it. Because if we don't allow grief, which many in our culture do not, for a variety of reasons, if we don't allow ourselves to grieve fully, we're going to carry a lot of unhealed grief inside of us, which many of us, if not all of us, do. And that unhealed grief can be very toxic to our bodies, to our relationships, to all aspects of our life. So even though it's painful to see and to feel, it's far better to address it than to suppress it. So let's talk about making friends with grief. So to begin with, we recognize the loss. We recognize what that loss is. Sometimes we may feel sad, we may feel what people call depressed, and we're not sure why. So it can be helpful to explore that and just say, what feels lost, what feels missing in my life? The more specific you can be, the better. Sometimes we can't always be specific, but sometimes we can. I remember many times as a pastoral minister, I would be counseling someone who lost a spouse after being married for many years. And she or he, usually it was a she, would say, I miss John horribly. We were married for 40 years. I miss him terribly. And I would say, well, just tell me, what is it you miss about him being gone? And then she would talk about, well, I miss the morning walks we used to take. I miss the conversations over the dinner table. I miss going to the movies with him every Friday and then getting an ice cream cone afterwards. I miss snuggling with him on a cold winter night in bed, and so on and so forth. Because these are really all the things that we're grieving. We're not grieving just a person or a circumstance, but we're grieving all of the different places where we connected with that individual or that particular organization or job or whatever it was that feels lost. So we grieve what we had and lost. That's important. And also, it's a little more difficult to identify, but we grieve what we needed and never got, particularly as children. If we never got the kind of parenting that we needed, or we never got the kind of health care that we needed, or the kind of education that we needed, if we never got our needs met, or if our needs were chronically unmet, there's going to be a lot of grief around that. And that can be sometimes hard to recognize. But until we recognize it, what happens is that whenever that need shows up in our life today, what we're typically aware of is more the grief or the loss than the need itself. And so we may continue to deny ourselves of that particular human need. The need for safety or for love or for self-expression or for acknowledgement or for joy, for play, whatever it is. So it's very important to acknowledge what we needed and didn't get. And the healing of that is to grieve it, to grieve that loss. We grieve our lost hopes and dreams. Oftentimes when a marriage ends or a relationship ends, we grieve not only what we had and what's not here, but what really never happened, what we wanted to happen that didn't. I know personally, when my father died many years ago, 25 years ago, I missed him. I grieved the loss of my father. But I realized soon that I was grieving also, even more so, the grief of the father that I never really had that I wanted. I never had the kind of relationship with my father that I really wanted to have. And so that grief was really the biggest part of my grief over my father's death, because I knew that that would never happen after he died, or at least not in a physical way. So it's important to recognize our lost dreams, our lost hopes. It's really important to remove any shame that we have around grief. And it's real deep in our culture because, most of the time when people will start to cry, they'll hide their face or they'll apologize. They'll say, "I'm sorry." It's sort of like they're embarrassed for weeping. I remember years ago, I mean, this is many years ago, I think in the 60s, there was a presidential candidate, Edward Muskie, I think it was, from Maine, who lost the election because he was speaking and he teared up around something. And just those few tears that could be seen on the camera cost him the election. That probably won't happen today, but this was back in the 60s. So, grieving is healing. To grieve fully is to heal. And if we're ashamed of, or we repress our grief, or deny our grief, then the healing is not going to take place. So, making friends with grief and understanding it. What is grief? What's it all about? Grief is actually a process. Grief itself is an ensemble of emotions. Sadness, of course, and typically anger, sometimes guilt or remorse. But loneliness is very frequent with grief. So it's a whole collage of emotions that come and go, and they're not straight line emotions. They pop up here and there. And denial is a natural part of the process, particularly if there's a big loss. It's like our system is saying, wait a minute, that's more than I can take in. I need to absorb it slowly. It's like it's an emotional shock absorber. So denial is not a bad thing unless we get stuck in it. Sooner or later, obviously, we need to go beyond it. But it's important to not push yourself or anybody else. Grief has its own timetable. There's no schedule. There's no formula. Each of us grieves in our own way, and we grieve in our own style. And any loss that we have will inevitably trigger unresolved grief from previous losses. And that's one reason why we can't gauge what might be called appropriate grief or reasonable grief, either in intensity or in length, because if we lose something, it may be seemingly relatively minor, like the death of a dog or a cat, but that grief may be unleashing a lot of hidden grief that we've carried for a long time. I know a lot of people, when they get divorced, suddenly feel the grief of their parents' divorce. And so there's a lot of healing that takes place. That's the good news. The bad news is it sometimes can feel overwhelming. So it's very important not to rationalize or to judge, I shouldn't be grieving this much over this little thing. Because even one tiny thing can unleash a whole deluge of tears, if you will. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, our deepest grief, our deepest pain is our separation from our own true self, our own true nature, our Buddha nature. That's the most painful of all. So when we can feel that separation, when we can feel the pain of being disconnected, to being alienated from the depth of who we are, that's really a good thing. And it's a good thing because feeling that pain is what brings us home, what brings us back to, or home to, our authentic self. Oftentimes in Sufi poetry, Rumi and Hafiz often talks about the longing for the beloved and the crying for the beloved and the weeping over the missing beloved, the beloved being capital B, beloved, being the divine or being our own true nature. Feeling the grief is the path to return. So I'm going to finish by reading this short poem from Rumi. He says, "Don't run away from grief, O soul. Don't run away from grief, O soul. Look for the remedy inside the pain. Look for the remedy inside the pain, because the rose came from the thorn and the ruby came from a stone." Thank you for sharing the Dharma practice with us, and may you be blessed in every way possible.